Yeah, so the idea of racial trauma is, really based on the experiences that people of color have around race, right? So it's certainly it's precipitated by some type of event, which can be, discrimination, racial discrimination, or, hate crimes or things like that there. But it's really, the trauma is talking about how that individual has experienced that, right? And the stress, the emotions, and stuff that go along with that around their experiences of race and racism, right? So, um, there's some research out there that talks about, how that can be almost even equated to uh, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, right? I mean, you see the sort of same manifestations sort of in that, right? And one of the crazy things about racial trauma is that, the person of color doesn't even necessarily have to experience firsthand sort of a hate crime or discrimination, even witnessing it, right? I mean, in the sort of society that we live in, you see, particularly for young, black, folks, is that, they see, unarmed black men and women being, shot and killed and things like that there. That's a very, that can be very traumatizing, right? I heard a story, and another example of is I heard a story that, after the election in 2016 in the locker room, you have a little Latino kid in there, and, there's a bunch of other kids in that locker room sort of starting to yell and chant, build the wall, build the wall, build the wall, right? I mean, that, again, sort of thinking about the kind of, what that can do to a young person in particular and how traumatizing that can be and how that can make them feel sort of unsafe, right? And the stress that goes along with that based on, again, their racial background. So that's the idea of racial trauma, right? I mean, it's really talking about the experience that goes along with that and then all of the symptoms that formulate around the experiences of being a person of color in our society. So, yeah. Let me start over. So what racial trauma, could look like in a student or in a, person of color, um, sort of anxiety, depression, right? Sort of those kinds of manifestations, in what they typically look like, right? As a person, may try to avoid certain situations, certain sort of places and things like that there, because they, are afraid that they're going to be, either bullied or picked on or experience discrimination as a result of, their racial background, right? So that's most typically what racial trauma would sort of look like, right? Is again, some form of anxiety or, stress or, even depression, and then those sort of avoidance behaviors. That's why, again, the idea that racial trauma is considered to be sort of a similar to post-traumatic stress disorder, right? Is that, you see those same patterns of behavior that someone who's experienced a very traumatic event, near-death experience or something like that, that they start to engage in those kinds of behaviors and so on. So, yeah. Yeah, so historical trauma is sometimes also referred to as intergenerational trauma, but it's the idea that you come from a cultural or racial background where your ancestors, your parents, your grandparents, your great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents, and so on, have experienced some very traumatic events, right? So, and most typically in the United States, it's thought about for American Indians or Native American people, right? I mean, the idea that, people were, killed off through massacres, mass relocations, you know, uh, displacement, right? Those kinds of things there, are very traumatic, right, to a community, to a family. The taking of children, sending them to border schools. Those were very, very traumatic experiences that your parents, your grandparents, your great-grandparents experienced, right? And then as a result of your great-grandparents and your ancestors experiencing those traumatic events, created, again, those symptoms of trauma, right? Anxiety, depression, fear, loss of power, feeling of powerlessness, hopelessness, all of those things that kind of go along with that, right? And then, and instead of, passing down, language and cultural values and practices, instead they pass down those feelings, those emotions that were attached to those historical events, right? So those emotions that go along with the trauma that your parents and grandparents and great-grandparents experience gets passed down to the next generation, right, into the next generation. That's the idea of historical trauma, right? So again, even though, like for myself, for example, I was never sent to boarding school, but my father was sent to boarding school, right? Taken from his family, sent 150, 200 miles away. I didn't experience that firsthand, but yet I still sort of experienced that because I hear and heard all those stories of what that was like, right? And then, of course, not being able to teach me the language, not, and then, having a very, very strict, sort of parental experience in the boarding school, that was also passed down to me. So the idea of dysfunction gets passed down from one generation to the next, right? And then in modern times, right, the way that manifests itself, historical trauma manifests itself in people of color today, and indigenous students today, are very similar to, again, of actually, re-experiencing that trauma, right? And you'll see that there's, signs of anxiety and depression and, feelings of hopelessness and powerlessness in certain situations, because of that context that we live in, of having a racialized society and having that part of our history. And Native people in particular are constantly reminded of this. That's the other way that historical trauma manifests itself and sort of shows itself up, is that, when the idea that, we sort of been, sort of banned to sort of small tracts of land called reservations, and then if we leave the reservation or, live someplace else, we're still reminded of the fact that, these terrible things happened in history, right? Because this land used to be Native land, but now there's no Native people living here, right? That there's mostly white people living here, have businesses and jobs and all of those things, right? So there's sort of this perpetual sort of way that it continues to manifest itself, and then reminds Native people of the historical trauma that happened to their ancestors. So, yeah, so the idea that how trauma or historical trauma gets passed down through generations really, again, has to do with how, certain cultural values and practices that once existed with this cultural group were taken away from them, right? And then they were replaced sort of with dysfunction, right? Extreme poverty and all of those kinds of things, right? So that generation, was taken from them and replaced with something dysfunctional, right? So then they pass on that dysfunction to the next generation. That's sort of the idea of how historical trauma continues to pass itself on. Yeah, I think, racial trauma and historical trauma are definitely related to each other, right? I mean, they're sort of part of each other, right? I mean, and the key thing is that both racial trauma and historical trauma have the same manifestations in the person, right? Again, those feelings of stress, anxiety, depression, sort of hypervigilance in certain situations and contexts where race is being made more salient in particular, right? So, because, it's not only Native people who've experienced and do experience historical trauma. Almost every racial group of color, right? Almost every racial minority group in the United States has some form of historical trauma, that they've experienced as, being a, sort of, in the United States and being, living in a racialized society where this, race was socially constructed to basically create advantage and privilege for one group and disadvantage and trauma for the other group. Right, right. Yeah, I mean, it is true, again, because we live in a racialized society, every new group of people who've come to the United States had to figure out some way where they fit in to this racialized society, right? And, for Europeans, Western Europeans in particular, and, people with light skin and white skin, that sort of fitting in was a lot easier, right? But for people of color, right, that fitting in has sort of never been easy because we have a racialized society where race matters and, there's privilege and disadvantage, that goes along with the color of your skin. So they, continue to experience that from that point on, and then they're, their next generation will experience that, and so on and so on. So that's again how racial trauma and historical trauma are, sort of related to each other. Sure, sure. So the idea of microaggressions or racial microaggressions is a relatively recent sort of term, although they've always been around, right? And what racial microaggressions are really these very subtle forms of discrimination, right? And the sort of insidious thing about racial microaggressions in particular is that most often they're unintentionally and unconsciously committed by the perpetrator. And they're these sort of everyday verbal, sometimes behavioral, environmental sort of sayings or comments or actions that sort of convey an underlying meaning to the victim, right? So they come in different forms. There's racial sort of insults, and then there's racial micro-invalidations, right? So a racial insult would be, for example, ascribing some type of or some form or level of intelligence to someone based on their race, right? So again, in an academic setting or a school setting, right? I mean, there's a stereotype that exists that people of color are not that smart. I mean, that stereotype has been around forever, right? So the idea that you assume or ascribe some level of intelligence to a person of color based on their race is a microaggression, right? I mean, and it can even actually go the opposite way in some ways, or I don't know if the opposite way is the right term. Let me rephrase that. I mean, sometimes it can sort of come off as a compliment, but in fact, there's an underlying meaning to that, right? So, for example, someone who's Asian, right, is assumed to be good at math or science or something like that, right? That's, again, you're assuming or ascribing some level of intelligence, but this person may have no interest in math or, physics or science, just because they're Asian, sort of, so again, you can see that might be sort of look like a sort of a positive or a compliment, but in fact, it can still have a negative impact on this person of color, right, in that academic setting, right, and you're pushing something onto that person just based on what you assume about that individual, right? So that's one example of a micro insult, which is a form of a racial microaggression, right? Sometimes it's really, really sort of hidden and sort of insidious. Another example of that would sort of be, being held up as a sort of an exemplar or a credit to your race, right? Because if you're a person of color and you happen to be, doing really, really well in school and have, a great GPA and so on, a comment like, there should be more of them like you, or I wish there were more, students of color like you. Again, on the surface, that sounds like, a compliment, right? But there's an underlying meaning, right? That most students of color are not as smart like you. So, you're sort of seen as, someone who's, there's the underlying message there, right, is that, people of color are not smart. You see what I'm saying, right? So that's, again, how, and a person who says something like that is not intentionally trying to harm that individual, or even, is not even fully aware or conscious of the fact that has a different meaning for that individual, right? So, yeah.
I want to.
For sure. Yeah. So, again, that's the insidious, so one of the insidious natures or things about microaggressions in general is really how hidden they are, right? And how most of the time, again, they're unintentionally committed, right? Because, again, we have a racialized society, and we have a whole history around that where stereotypes have been created about individuals, and biases have been created within individuals, right? When you live in a racialized society and you grow up learning, most of the time unconsciously, all the stereotypes that exist about every single racial group in our society, right? So you sort of, you take those things on unconsciously, and they become ingrained, and then you go around, saying things or doing things that have a certain meaning to them, but you don't realize the meaning that those have, because again, when you have a racialized society, the norm here is white culture, white society, the white standard, and everything else is compared to that, right? And you don't often even realize that, right? So when you go, so that's how, those things manifest themselves, unconsciously in individuals, is that they will, you know, assume that everybody is the same, but that sameness is them, right? In terms of their whiteness, right? For, a really, common example of that, that I really think highlights that, is the idea of color blindness. So color blindness itself is in fact a microaggression, right? Because it's a micro invalidation, and really what it is because you're denying sort of this person's racial experience as a person of color, right? And for someone to say that I don't see color, you're basically denying part of their existence, right? Part of their identity. When you say that I don't see color, I see you as a human being, so that's a classic example, right, of how the person doesn't even realize what that actually means to the individual of color, right? When you say that I don't see color, when you're looking right at me, and I'm obviously a person of color, you see this color of my skin, you see that I'm, not white, I might be black, Asian, Latino, whatever it is, right? And then you say that, I don't see color, I only see human beings, you're denying that person's experience. So. Okay, so no, it's fine. Let me sort of just think about that for a second. So, we got this fly here bugging me here. So, let me go back and try to sort of rephrase what you just said there. Right, so again, the reason why we even are having a conversation about racial microaggressions, right, is because we live in a sort of a racialized society, right, where race was constructed to create advantage and privilege for one group of people and disadvantage and all of those traumas and experiences that go along with that, right? And that's been going on for a long time. I mean, since the sort of inception of, the United States, really. And so we've gone through many things in our history where we've tried to address that, right? Where we've tried to address racism and racial discrimination and all of those things, right? So that's what makes it even more tricky, right? Is that, we've had civil rights movements and those kinds of things, end of slavery and all of that, and, end of sort of different areas in our history, right? And white folks think that because we've done those things, that racism doesn't exist anymore. And then that's how you can have a white person say something like that, well, I'm not racist, or I'm not a racist, right? Because I didn't own slaves, or I didn't, take Native people's land, right? And a white person can say that, right? Because they've experienced the privilege of being white, and they don't recognize and realize that they've experienced that privilege, right? So what we need to do is we need to move to a point where folks realize that, being non-racist basically contributes to the status quo. By making statements that I'm not a racist contributes to the status quo of racism, right? What we need to do is move to a point where people are anti-racist. Those are two different things. A non-racist and anti-racist are two different sort of manifestations of how you address racism, right? Non-racist is just going about doing your everyday things and sort of ignoring and being colorblind. And anti-racist is recognizing that there's inequality that exists, there's inequity that exists around race, and then taking steps and action to try to address those inequities. Did that help?
Yeah.
Okay. That was a big one, man. So.
Yeah.
So how racial trauma and historical trauma impact students of color, in particular, in modern times, is, hold on. Let me sort of rethink this, my response here. So, okay. So as a result of this historical trauma and continued racial trauma that exists in our society, right, our students of color continue to experience sort of these traumatic symptoms and so on, right, around depression, anxiety, in the way that can manifest itself in the school setting, right, is excessive absences from school, not doing well in school, not being able to study very well, living, in their home environments when they're away from school, right? Experiencing, significant adverse childhood experiences or ACEs, right? Living in poverty, not having enough food to eat, things like that, right? It sort of, has an impact in the classroom for those particular students, right? I mean, the idea that adverse childhood experiences, particularly for students of color and indigenous students, is that we experience those more than, other groups in society. There's a disparity that exists there, right? And in fact, American Indian students in our region, in our area, are, really sort of off the charts, right? Most, on average, most, youth in America probably experience maybe 1 or 2 adverse childhood experiences in their lifetime. American Indian students and other students of color are 8 or 9 or 10 in their lifetime, right? That's a huge disparity that exists. So, and again, there's many, many different forms of adverse childhood experiences. Again, living in poverty is one, not having enough food to eat, being, displaced from your home, right? Either evicted or something like that there. Having, a parent in and out of the household is a form of adverse, of course, experiencing, some type of physical assault, sexual assault, those kinds of things are adverse childhood experiences. So they come in a bunch of different forms. So if students of color are experiencing those at 8, 9, 10 in their lifetime, just in their childhood lifetime, right, that can have detrimental effects in the classroom, in the academic settings.
I want to hit this point one more time. It's off the charts. It's much higher.
Okay. So just say something like that.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, just like.
Just a more sort of compact,
Yeah.
okay, statement, okay. Okay, so if we talk about adverse childhood experiences, right? So white students usually, on average, experience maybe 2 or 3 of those in their childhood or in their lifetime, right? But American Indian students and students of color are experiencing those off the charts. Usually 8 or 9 or even 10 adverse childhood experiences in their childhood or their lifetime. Is that good?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so I can jump in on that. So how racial microaggressions affect students of color and indigenous students, really, particularly in the classroom or in the academic settings, sort of shows itself up in education disparities, right? And again, just a couple of quick examples of what that racial microaggression might look like. And again, how sort of insidious and unintentional it actually is, right? Like one common example, which is more of an environmental racial microaggression, is the lack of teachers of color, right? Going your whole academic career, K through 12, and never having a teacher of color. Again, no one's doing that on purpose. That's sort of not intentionally happening or being intentionally done, right? But it has an impact on a student of color, right? That's a racial microaggression and no one's actually doing on purpose. But that has a negative impact on a student of color because they don't see any role models who look like them, right, in front of the classroom. That's one example. Another common example, in fact, actually happens, which more often than you think it does, is that being singled out for your race. So when a topic comes up about people of color, right, whether it be black folks, Native folks, Latinos, Asians, whatever, right, and if you're only 1 or 2 of that particular racial group in your classroom, that everybody looks to you to speak to that. Even the teacher, right? It happens K through 12 and it happens in college. In college, it can be a little bit more excusable, but at the K through 12, that should never happen. A teacher should never rely on the student to be the expert on the topic, right? So, you're being singled out in that situation as a result of your racial background, right? Particularly if you're a student of color. And again, think about this for a second. White people are never asked to speak for all white people, but Native people are always asked to speak for all Native people, to represent, right? And that's huge pressure. And of course, what that does to a student of color, right, is that basically just shuts them down, shrinks them down, right? And it puts this huge amount of stress on them to have to represent all the time. And that's an extra burden that gets sort of carried around, a psychological burden that they got to carry around in the back of their mind, that I've got to live up to some certain sort of, expectation or standard or something or so on, right? So again, that can have a huge negative impact over a student's sort of academic career when, again, you start sort of experiencing trauma as a result of that, right? I mean, you engage in avoidance behaviors. I don't want to go to that class because that teacher is always asking me to speak for all Native people, right? I don't even want to be in this situation right now, right? So that's how it ends up manifesting itself and showing up again as, traumatic symptoms through microaggressions that happen.
I want to loop back on the same thing, carry with them.
Right. Yeah, so, again, racial microaggressions exist within a context of a racialized society, right? So, the key part of that is, I think, in terms of how that can manifest itself in terms of traumatizing symptoms or trauma symptoms, is that there's this accumulation, there's sort of cumulative effects, right? In fact, can we pause for a second here? Sorry. I know you want to kind of short or whatever, but it's, I sort of had to, sort of.
I think that point you're making, though, is the key one, the cumulative piece.
Yeah.
Like, oh, that's just minor, but the fact that it's happening all the
Right.
time. So exactly what you were saying. And
Right.
I don't even know if we need to call it trauma. I think that accumulation of
Yeah. Of stress. Yeah.
is what we want
Yeah.
to kind of emphasize.
Yeah.
Just because that's really powerful what you were saying.
Right.
About that,
Right. Okay, I got it. Thanks. So let me start over. So, yeah.
I'm wondering also because.
Okay. So racial microaggressions, in fact, are a form of adverse childhood experiences, right? So it's the discrimination, experiencing discrimination as a person of color is an adverse childhood experience, right? In and of itself, right? So, and then the key thing about that we have to keep in mind is that there's an accumulative effect of racial microaggressions or discrimination, racism, those kinds of things, right? I mean, again, for people of color, there's a constant reminder, right? You have your racial reality, in fact, is that you have to worry about whether or not something is going to happen to you today because of your race, right? White folks never have to worry about that, and rarely, if ever. I mean, maybe sometimes if you work, with all people of color or something, you might have to think about that, right? But you still sort of have some privilege and advantage that goes along with that, right? But for people of color, you constantly, when you wake up in the morning and you look in the mirror, you see a person of color there, right? And then your experience over time of experiencing these little microaggression here, little microaggression there, takes its toll on a person's both psychological and then also their physical and physiological impacts. In fact, I did a couple of studies on this where I demonstrated that even watching somebody else experience a microaggression has a negative psychological and physiological impact on that individual. So that's stress. There's a whole sort of health area here, a stress paradigm, that it's not like major life catastrophes are killing people. I mean, they are, right? I mean, experiencing a tornado, earthquake, hurricane, things like that. Yes, those things are traumatic, right? But and they create stress. But experiencing microaggressions day in and day out, experiencing these sort of daily hassles, right? These daily stressors day in and day out actually have longer term, more negative health impacts on individuals. So again, thinking about that in terms of the classroom, right? When you have a student of color who's experiencing microaggressions, whether that be daily, weekly, whatever, that has an accumulative effect on that student's performance and academic ability.
The cumulative effect.
Okay, so one of the things that is really, really important to realize and know about racial microaggressions is that, in fact, they're part of let me start over. So racial microaggressions, in fact, are adverse childhood experiences for students of color and indigenous or native students, right? Experiencing discrimination because of your race is an adverse childhood experience in and of itself, okay? And then the other part of that that's really important to know and understand is that there's an accumulative effect on experiencing racial microaggressions. And the research shows that this falls sort of within the stress paradigm of health effects on individuals, both psychological and physiological, right? That experiencing daily hassles, right, micro stressors, everybody experiences those, and if you experience many of those over time, that has long-term health impacts on individuals, right? So, certainly experiencing a catastrophe, tornado, hurricane, earthquakes, those kinds of things have a negative impact on people. But in fact, it's the daily stressors, the daily hassles that have more of a negative impact on our health outcomes than those major life catastrophes, right? So for people of color, experiencing microaggressions, day in, day out, daily, weekly, and so on, right, takes its toll over time, right? In fact, I did a study where I had students, in fact, watch somebody else experience a microaggression. So they vicariously experience a microaggression by watching somebody else experience a microaggression. And the results showed that it actually had a negative impact psychologically. It decreased their positive affect, feelings of positiveness and happiness, and it increased their negative affect, so feelings of anxiety and depression, hostility, and it also had a physiological effect on them as well too, in terms of increasing their heart rate and their blood pressure. So you put those things together, right? That's not good for you, right, over time. So in terms of how that impacts students in the classroom, right, is that they're experiencing sort of these hypervigilance, right, this hyper arousal, right, of not sort of wanting to be there, feeling uncomfortable while they're there because they're constantly worried about, having to experience a microaggression. It's, one more little piece about that, in fact, is actually a lot of times even you don't even realize, that the microaggression has happened until after the fact. That's the crazy thing about microaggressions, right? Is that there's this dead fly on my head. Sorry. The crazy thing about microaggressions is that many times a perpetrator doesn't realize that they're engaging in a microaggression or committed a microaggression, and a lot of times the victim doesn't realize that a microaggression happened until after the fact, right? So that many times you can't even react to it in real time, and then after the fact you kind of start thinking and asking yourself, did I think what happened just happened? Why did they say that? What do they mean by that, right? That in and of itself is causing psychological and physiological harm, because you have to sort of waste energy, right? It takes up energy to actually even process that and think about that, and then of course you're going to be much more hesitant to even engage or enter that situation again. Okay, so racial microaggressions, in fact, are an example of an adverse childhood experience. Okay, experiencing discrimination and so on, and then those effects are cumulative over time, right? If you experience racial microaggressions over time, it takes its toll, right? It builds up and adds up in terms of psychological and physiological effects on the individual, right? And then the result of that, right, manifests itself in academic performance or lack of academic performance, or even being absent from school. Those are sort of how those things manifest themselves in an academic setting, for example. Good?
Yes.
Okay.